I like to start with some observations based on these 2.5 days. Very rich kind of presentation on many different topics. The center is really exhibition, but the issues are wide ranging from art history, and from collecting, from technology. I learned I have to say awful lot, just very rich, very beneficial for myself. I feel the most interesting thing about this event is about temporality. Seems really we move gradually from the history of the exhibitions of East Asian artworks, and then gradually about new questions, new experiments, including some recent experiments in past few years, and then gradually move like today and yesterday, yesterday, the second half, move to like a present and the future. I feel this range in terms of temporality really, I feel distinguish, characterize these particular events. So put us in a spot of not just thinking about history, but also thinking about the entire experience of exhibitions. So, for myself, I feel I learned one thing is really about history is really there's some models, some basic models in our museums in the West in exhibiting East Asian art and where they come from. And at the beginning, we didn't have these models. In the beginning, there were curiosity rooms, there's a junk, there's the different things, but gradually it became like a Chinese art rooms, the different things. So I feel I was taking notes, and there are some basic models. It's still very important, just the cornerstones. One, I feel based on these, now we begin to think about new models. So these existing fundamental models, I feel one is in terms of general framework. There is a country like China or Japan or Korea. This function as a general framework. This we can say country, we can say culture, but the general idea is more like a modern nation state. And but we also talk about history. That's one. Another very important model is a periodization. Within each country, its culture, we have a different periods, and basically following this more linear model in the West. And the third one is equally fundamental, is based on objects. It's a medium and genre, either painting gallery or jade or bronze. These have been shared model, I feel, is very important. And another one we heard more today, not in every museum, but in some museums, is more this architecture model. Either it's a fictional or reconstructed, but use architecture to frame objects and works. So we have the Chinese temple or China room, this kind of model. I feel these are all existing models, but they actually developed over a long period and become perfected, developed, enriched during this course. So I'm not thinking we should replace them, but we can enrich them. So I also, toward this second part about enrichment or add some new ideas or new experiment, I also took some notes. The first one is an extension of a chronological and the geographical span. For example, chronologically, now contemporary art is becoming a very important part of exhibiting East Asian art. Traditionally, we didn't have that. So modern and contemporary art that definitely represent a very important development. And also geographically, I feel there's very important implications just what is China, what is historical China or Japan or Korea. So those I feel have been expanding as well. And chronologically, since we study archaeology, we have new materials from prehistory that also bring in new concept about time and place and space. That's why I feel it's ongoing, has been going on for a while, but probably will change the traditional framework in one way. Another is I heard several presentations or cases. It's really try to rethink this spatial framework I just defined based on country and culture, like Seattle, and they use Asia as a framework, as Australia also rethink about this nation state-based framework. And even in some university museums, we're thinking about replacing this kind of framework with some other kinds. Also debates, LACMA, probably this is something people are thinking. Is this old framework, like based on country or something, very useful or should be reconsidered? I hear this, I find very interesting. Also recent exhibitions using other framework like trade, like a Silk Road, like ocean. So these are all somehow a departure from the old, this kind of national framework. Another thing I find very interesting is we just talked about the new development is about the technology. Digital, I feel, is a part of it, but there's other kind of new technologies about the visual, about the sound, about, because we live in this technological kinds of rapidly developed. And actually, East Asia is at the forefront of this, we may call it revolution, is technology. So it's many East Asia areas, countries are leading this trend, like Japan, like China, like Taiwan, like Korea, is all technologically at the forefront of this trend. So I feel using technology to represent East Asian art is really very logical. It's not just learning this from the West. Actually, it's being created by many people in East Asian countries, including the presentations we just heard from these two gentlemen from Chinese universities, one artist, other technicians. I feel they are doing something is quite amazing in our field, just globally speaking. So technology, I feel definitely is very important. I feel definitely every curator is thinking about it in what way can incorporate this into the museums, the exhibitions. I'm sure there are many, many ways. I do feel there will be a platform allow us to exchange information because there are always new plan, new information. Like today, if some way we can periodically have this kind of meeting, exchange like a new project, new ideas. So that's another, I feel, new direction. Another very important direction I feel is also maybe controversial. I feel it's really, we heard at least two examples is this fashion show and also Mr. Yang Liu's the very interesting exhibition. I want to describe it as more like a aesthetically inspired, try to arouse people's artistic imagination and not squarely based on old model like historical facts, whatever, serve a different set of purpose more artistic, also speak to the audience here, use their existing knowledge, but try to renew it. But of course, there are historical elements that fashion show that includes a lot. But this direction I find very interesting because it has a clear sense of audience. And I would say it's experimental. Actually, both the curators use this term. I find it's an interesting direction, more contemporary oriented, experimental, more artistic. Another direction I feel is very, very important. I would like to hear more, just because we are talking about exhibitions in the West. So how to represent Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and other Asian people, this diaspora is outside. They have been living in the West for generations. And so these are Chinese art as well. So how to include this kind of experience, artworks, visual culture, that's one thing. Another thing, just in this process, how Chinese or East Asian art contribute to global art. I feel actually the fashion show really emphasize this part. It's not just defined within itself, but actually has played a role in shaping like a global cosmopolitan culture or local culture. I feel that's maybe involves some kind of redefinition of East Asian art or culture, but I feel it's really related. So this aspect I feel we touch upon, but I really feel it's a very important thing. I'm sure every museum talking about the community, talking about outreach project, but how exhibitions can reflect that, take it seriously, not just like a PR kind of thing. I feel could be very, very interesting. So here just my own notes, based on notes, both from history and the potential I learned from this event so far. I'm sure everybody have has a lot to say. So I invite the roundtable panelists for the roundtable to say whatever you feel, something about the events as a whole. I feel we can leave the details in maybe to the future, just something broader, something about more future oriented comments. Okay, so please, just you can raise hand or you can just speak out directly, either way, yeah.
I think I probably will say something first. So thank you, Professor, for that summary. That's really great. And I just want to go back to kind of the issue related to geographic location. So and then the theme of the conference called Exhibiting East Asian Art in the West. And I'm going to call out Noelle again. Sorry, Noelle in her email say that do you want to change your conference name into Exhibiting East Asian Art outside East Asia? So don't want to create that kind of dichotomy, between East and West. So and we thought about that, and then indeed the whole point of the conference is that when things from East Asia being exhibited outside this geographical location, so what do you do with it? How people outside this region, how do they deal with it? And then that location is quite important. When artifacts moved, especially in the early history, things being sold to the Western countries mostly. So when the artifacts moved, their meanings also reshaped, right? And then I think that's a very important part that we want to get to. But how do we capture that? Do we want to put it in the East-West, or is a better way to do it? And then at the end, we didn't change the name. We still kind of stick to it. And I can only speak for myself. I don't know if Chelsea or Professor or Kathy have different thoughts, but I feel like, my research on 1920s and 30s American collection, the Chinese art in American collection, that dichotomy was very clear. It's always about the East dealing with something that's from West, dealing something from the East Asia. So I think it's not we are trying to capitalize that way. It's really that was a historical fact that at least I dealt with, right? So, and of course today in today's circumstances, it may not be politically correct. They don't want to do that. And yet, if we want to go back to the history, think about how it started. And I think that, exhibiting East Asian art in the West, I think that phrase will still stand. But I don't know how you guys think about this.
Maybe just, oh, go ahead, Tao.
Oh, sorry, I just want to kind of maybe just give one kind of a thought on that, because I think Professor Wu Hong has just touched upon, say, what are the turning points in this exhibiting Asian art? Because in the 19th century or early 20th century, cabinets of curiosities, that was the model in many museums or different contexts. But when they become professionalized, I think it's also to do with the understanding of further kind of research happened in the academic world, because I think around the 1920s, particularly excavations, archaeological excavations started in China, that had really changed the Western view of Chinese civilization. So China became very much part of this, I'm sorry to use the word superior civilization. So they moved them from ethnographical museums into the proper fine art museum. So that's, I think it's quite interesting to tell. Another thing I found very much kind of, well, suddenly occurred to me, I was listening to Marty's panel about canons. And I suddenly realized, actually we do in all collections or any Western museum collections, there are a lot of famous artists, but 80% or 90% are fakes. So it's not say the Western were trying to beat this canon based on Chinese canon, it's big names, but they didn't get real works. They all get fakes. So that's pumped me to think, when we recreating this canon in the West and display them to the public, we actually been showing a lot of fakes, and what kind of reception or results due to this, I think almost intended, I mean, it works intended as to deceive rather than to represent the culture. So that's kind of a question I think we haven't explored at the conference, and I quite like to kind of get people's view on that. And of course, another thing I think I was thinking, sitting, listening to Shen Chen's presentation about this stereotype of Asians. And I suddenly realized we are curators or scholars, we are part of this, what we call agency in this change. And then in the Nelson or Philadelphia, this reconstruction is also part of this visions of curators. So that's very much kind of defined by the historical context itself. And so for the future, I hope kind of not say curators' voice will be diminished. No voice can be heard from curators, was still voice or vision, but maybe it's going to become a part of many voices. So that's, I hope we'll not say, we'll just switch to another standard voice to cut off all the kind of noises from background. I hope not to repeat this kind of mistake. I just hope in the future we can hear more voices, different, what Wu Hong has said, technological, political, experimental, just become much more enriched field. That's what I feel after listening to so many wonderful presentations. Thank you.
Chelsea, you earlier raised hand.
Thank you. Yes. I think that, it's good that we acknowledged this, historical circumstances that defined our notion of the West, and, that not talking about it is not going to completely solve the problem unless we examine the framework. And carry to the present, which this
Chelsea, you're breaking up.
East-West is. Oh, really?
Yeah, Elizabeth.
Hold on,
Yeah.
just one moment. Okay. Well, it seems this is the best my Wi-Fi can do right now. Sorry.
No, it's fine.
It's
can
okay.
you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So just that we need to, that we can't, even if we stop talking about this framework of the West, because it's a historical term, as Wei said, it's not going to go away, right? And so I think one good thing is to examine this term in detail so that it doesn't remain as a monolith. And I hope that's exactly what our presenters did. So that we had, people talking about Australia, Canada, different parts of the US, right? And so in a way, in a way, I think our scholars have given us a model that we can carefully talk about the history of these different times and places. And also, I think in many of our talks, we saw a great model for all of us of how carefully research on past exhibitions can be carried out, right? And even as recent as the 1960s with Joseph Dolberg's talk, right? But he gave us such a careful context of how the exhibitions at several institutions were mapping onto historic, like, things that were going on politically in a variety of countries. And so to understand how these are all interrelated, the same thing with the talk on the Mongol exhibitions, right, that we saw, is very careful, taking apart of how exhibition practices are related to the circumstances in each region, I guess.
I wonder if I could pick up on that, the monolithic character of the West. A number of speakers addressed it, and it relates to the anti-Asia sentiment, which came up several times. Many people brought that up. And not only are museums, not only do museums have a responsibility, but the whole China field has responsibility. And I think actually the China field is partly responsible for some of the stereotypes. So many of the speakers, like Ping Feng, for example, and the other museums at Shenzhen, gave us examples how one can complicate this idea, right? Sometimes you look closely at the Middle Eastern point of view and what's called the Western point of view, and my God, actually they're not very different. You don't want to homogenize, but the reason the West seems monolithic is since the 18th century, whenever Europeans absorb important ideas from outside, they put the Western stamp on it and say, we did it. And Asianists are largely responsible for transmitting those myths. It starts with Montesquieu. It goes on with Horace Walpole, who borrowed from the Chinese garden, and that said, no, that's the English garden. And late 19th century, they borrow from Japan. They say, no, this is modern, and so on. It goes, there's a long history of this. I think we should not be so polite. We have a responsibility to straighten it out, not to say, oh, they did it first, but to show, as Ping Feng and others showed us, how to reveal the interactions that are going on and the complexity. One other thing I would say in that regard, and this goes back to Chen Shen's point, he put this nicely: systemic racism has its roots in the core images that shape people's impressions of China. Some of those core images come out of the China field and are completely false, like the idea of a rigid social hierarchy. Europe had a rigid social hierarchy. Actually, when the English radicals in the 18th century fought to open up European society, make it into a post-feudal society. China was their model, and it wasn't a false model. It was, China was post-feudal. They were reading Chinese documents, which were much more open politically than any you had in Europe. And they said, oh, that's liberty of the press. We need to do that too. Some of our stereotypes, not just the hierarchy model, which comes from Fairbank, but you know, the notion that the emperor was all powerful, that's simply false. That's not, or that he was divinely ratified. That's not true either. A.C. Graham, you know, took care of that years ago. Anyone who reads classical Chinese texts knows that's not true. So we have a responsibility to push back against some of these stereotypes in a way, which, as Anne Feng put nicely, would, let's say, how did she put it, attempt to bridge diverse understandings of complex issues. And to do that, we have to rely on the facts. So we can't just take some of these stereotypes and represent them as if that's Chinese history. We need to be careful about what we call history.
Thank you. Deborah, do you have comments?
Well, one of the things that struck me so much from the presentations that I heard over the past 3 days is in addition to the dialogue that we're all having about essentialization or misrepresenting history, we also are hearing a lot about the ways that exhibition design and curatorial choice can help to address issues ranging from how the audience sees itself represented, what we can do to satisfy the desires and demands of the audience and their changing expectations inside the museum. And so, for example, we have in the panel that in the curatorial issues panel that I was moderating, we had just a fascinating discussion of exhibition design as a way to subtly break down barriers between perceived notions of nation states or cultural groupings being truly distinct from one another. Instead, you are encouraging the viewer, the audience, to make direct comparisons. In addition, we had fascinating discussions about exhibitions being perhaps controversial to an academic community in certain ways, but widely accepted by an audience that is maybe not as concerned about academic disputes, but more hungry for visibility. I know in our own museum, we have communities that desire more visibility than we can give right now, just based on the nature of space and the fragile nature of certain items in our collection that cannot be exhibited long-term, but they can certainly be available for special exhibitions. So there's a lot that can be done within the museum setting to subtly break down and reform some of the traditional ways of seeing and presenting information. I think we have more creativity sometimes than we might recognize. And we also have an opportunity to engage with audiences in a different way. And that gets back to some of the technological advances, the 3D imaging, for example, that allow us to put information and artifacts and spaces back into contextual conversations with each other that have been otherwise difficult to impossible to reconstruct if you weren't really dedicated to that particular object or space or artifact.
And Cassie, you want to ask them? You
Unmute.
unmute. yeah.
I see a question from Mei about how European colleagues are missing at the conference. We did have Anna Jackson, who did give us a lot of information about collecting in England at the V&A. I've had some contact with European museums through our projects, and they are very much interested in collaborating with us with our 3D imaging projects. And I know at the Rietberg in Zurich, they're now using some of our images for their reinstallation of their collections. So I think these are all interesting trends that we can build on together for increasing the cultural understanding and interactions of cultures that we are seeing encouraged in academics. This multicultural global studies, Silk Road studies, and a lot of this has come out in the talks.
I want to read Mei Rado's question because a lot of people cannot read it. She asked, European colleagues are missing in this conference. I wonder if anyone would like to discuss about the different exhibition history and, oh, disappeared.
It's moved.
Where?
I don't know where it
Went
went.
to the answered tab. I wonder if anyone would like to discuss about the different exhibition history and approaches in Europe in the roundtable.
I don't have even an answer.
I
think Cassie already answered part of this question. To my knowledge, actually, I do know some of my colleagues are in this conference because we share the interest about digital technology, so-called digital art history, and how to use this technology in studying and to showing like architecture and the reconstruction. So I believe there are some people out there. But I think Mei's point is correct because we should reach out more because the issues we are dealing with is not just about Chinese or Japanese Korean art. Often these departments or galleries are part of a larger museum, and any change of this part had to do with the rest of the museum. So I feel that's a very good point. So if we want to make some change, how do we make this change together through the communication, discussion, probably get more information at the same time. Our idea from this field can also contribute a larger discussion about museum culture. I feel it's a very good point. We should do it, and how to do it, that's up to everybody, I guess.
Yeah, we did have interest from curators and scholars in Europe, but in the end, some of them were not able to participate in the conference. Chelsea?
Yes, I'm putting in the chat, there's a relevant e-publication. It's from the Fletcher Coleman and I, and maybe some other people here participated, but it was the CIHA 2019 conference in Tokyo about museums and Asia, and it had, so because the Congress of, like International Congress of Art Historians, right, has many European and even South American members. So there were a few more talks on Europe, and particular, for example, like Italian House Museum or Austrian case of museums in Austria and how they present East Asia and the history of those collections, in many cases rooted in like either ethnography or Wunderkammer, and so I highly recommend the proceedings of this 2019 conference I put in the chat.
I wonder if I could add a footnote. The International Congress of Art Historians before 1992, I think, by international, they just meant Europe. It was only European art history. There was nothing outside of Europe or maybe America before 92. And then Frank Millen at COSVA got together and organized the first CIHA conference that actually included people who were not white, as well as fields that were not from Europe. So that, and since then it's been a very important, in spreading things around.
Thank you. I think we have some questions. Maybe we should read these questions and comments. And so here's one from, pardon me for the pronunciation, Noli Frida, right? East-West is a false dichotomy. Just like we try to eliminate the term non-Western, it's good to be specific. For example, United States, Europe, etc. So this is a comment. I think it's, we try. I feel there are different levels. So sometimes when we discuss a particular case, certainly we have to be very specific. But sometimes for conference or for big, like a general discussion, sometimes we are forced to use more general terms. And these terms are very hard to decide. Like in my department, often people say pre-modern is wrong, modern is wrong, global is wrong, non-Western is wrong, so international is wrong. So then what's new? So that is the main challenge. Another question or comments from Janet Baker. I enjoy some of the representations, but was not able to hear all of them, to my regret. I should say all these will be online, so people can review them or other people can see them. Phoenix Art Museum, we are planning some exhibitions in the near future, which will be cross-culture and cross-disciplinary. We will compare works from Europe, Asia, Middle East, Latin America in both historical and contemporary contexts. These will have themes that transcend any one particular culture, but be relevant to all cultures, reflecting the differences that have taken place over time and place.
Nice.
That is basically, that's very interesting. I'm very much looking forward to knowing more and seeing.
Can I just kind of add one kind of observation, because the theme has been raised over the presentations, particularly the Seattle new display of the new gallery display. We are kind of facing a new change, which I think are more cross-cultural, cross-regional. It's become a trend because the audience we have here wants it. But there's another aspect is the audience or part of our audience from East Asia, when they walk into museum, they're looking for Chinese art, Japanese art, Korean art. So we are dealing different kind of audiences here. And of course, because we are funded by taxpayers or whoever from the audience, we think more of the audience here rather than audience from the original countries. But it's a challenge. I think as a curator now, I feel a kind of course, we do have a role to play here as curator. I use the word agency because we sometimes bring different kind of considerations into this change. And sometimes we motivate or make the visions become realized in the real space. So I think it's a really hard job for a curator working at West Museum. I think it's we are dealing with a quite different kind of audiences or demands. So that's my feeling or my observation.
And not only that, but increasingly as museums try to expand the number of groups and both geographically, temporally, then as well as different groups within Chicago or the US, for example, space becomes increasingly an issue, right? And then it can appear quite chilling to those of us on the outside to see certain galleries, shut down or new ones created, then a certain type of art that used to have a space within the museum lose that space. And so I don't know how to avoid this where the physical pressures of space in the museum become a kind of mini geopolitics of like the real life space issues. And I think, possibly the digital, what we saw today, is one way we can address and kind of, because the digital space is endless. So that's the only thing I can think of.
There's a continuation of earlier points from Noli Guifrida about Wei responding to Professor Lin's earlier comments. Not to belabor the point, Wei, I completely agree that the emphasis of this symposium to be mostly located beyond Asia or countries of origin, in quotation marks. I really try to stop my students from seeing things such as the West and the rest. This is an issue in our history when surveys don't include Asia or Africa or minimize it. In my opinion, using East-West without critically defining the West can perpetuate problems, sort of like we wouldn't use the word Oriental without clarifying its use as a historical term and how it is not okay in today's environment.
Well, thank you, Noel. All the points are well taken. I think that's very true. And then I think not only you, I think most of us try to stop our students to think in such a sweeping, simplistic way. I think that's very important thing. But I think it's not try to justify what we have done, but I think it's important to keep in mind the historical framework in which we work with our materials, right? So, but I want to actually use this as an opportunity just to kind of respond to Professor Wu's earlier the summaries. I remember at first when we start thinking about this symposium, we are thinking very in a much smaller scale, thinking about the U.S., thinking about the historical museum, the museum which has the historical Chinese artifacts in their collection, right? So, but then Professor decided, suggest that we should probably expand the scope. Then so we include modern and contemporary and stuff. And then looking back, I think it's a great idea to include especially contemporary. I was very impressed by the panel, the four panelists who talked about the contemporary issues. But I also feel, I'm not sure if I am correct about that or not, but it seems like the framework we are using for historical research or talking about the museum, the exhibition history will not work so well for the contemporary world, right? So even this boundary between the East Asia and what is inside, what is outside, and I think that becomes very blurred. Just like I think yesterday when Professor also made the comments, a lot of Chinese artists who will make their work in China as well as outside China, right? So now that this line, so when we say exhibiting East Asia, now outside East Asia, it's not really exhibiting something that's from East Asia because now the artists are so mobile, right? So I just wonder, if Professor had anything to say about this when we think about the history of exhibiting East Asian art, we are thinking about from their collection. But now we're actually inviting East Asian artists in the museum, working in that more global sense. So should we kind of change the framework of our thinking of analysis when we get to the modern contemporary Rome?
Mm-hmm. Cassie?
Oh,
how long do we still have?
10 or 15 minutes we can go on, I think.
Yeah, maybe 10 minutes. So we have some questions, comments. One from Wei-Cheng. I quite agree that how Chinese art has contributed to global art is still much to be explored. Rereading Lovejoy's seminar's essay on the contribution of Chinese art in the emergence of Romanticism, we may think, for instance, whether chinoiserie was utilized solely as decorative elements, adding exotic flavor to the Western core. Perhaps we need to pay more attention to the period shortly after the Third Years' War and before 1700, the first phase of chinoiserie, when the European imagination of East Asia was quite different from later imagination in the 18th century. I think this is a fall into Professor Power's
Yes.
field. Do you want to? I like the idea. I feel it's not just as some superficial decorative elements, as these kind of non-Western elements are always conceived that way. I think Professor Power already mentioned that. Actually had a more profound, even structural influence. I feel that is the point of this comment. Marty, do you have any?
Yeah, you put it very well, Wu-Hong. Yeah, I published a book last year through Routledge Press. It's all about this. Please do have a look. But yeah, just briefly, although there were, and the book focuses actually a lot on what was mistaken and what was imagined and what wasn't. And the popular view among historians of Europe is that it was all made up, it was all imaginary. This is simply not the case. Much of it was based, the most important influences were coming from translations. I've looked at many of those translations and they're largely correct. There are interesting moments when they get it wrong. And that's usually when the Chinese text is talking about ideas that we now think of as Western, but because they weren't Western concepts then. So for example, 公益 or public opinion, Europeans were unable to translate it in the 18th century because there was no such concept in the West. Later on, they then stamped they stamped it as a Western concept. But indeed, that period that you lay out here, the period before Voltaire and Montesquieu and Rousseau and so on, is a very important one when really important European intellectuals were looking very carefully at not just at what the Jesuits claimed about China, but actual translations of essays by Jia Yi, Ouyang Xiu, Su Dongpo, Sima Guang, Wang Anshi, really important people, and very progressive, with very progressive views about equality, about dealing with corruption, about public and private interest, and so on. All of these were new ideas at the time. So yeah, it wasn't just about ornaments. Yeah, I think we can summarize it that way, but you put it very well, Wu-Hong, at the beginning.
Thank you. Thank you. I wonder, actually, there can be an interesting exhibition co-organized by people in Chinese art and export art and the European art to re-examine this issue, even try to change some concept, even in Western art, like a decorative. So all these are not important compared to other. I think this is very interesting. Yes, go ahead, Cassie. Cassie.
Oh, I'm just saying that it could include, like what you have studied, feminine space. That would be a very interesting comparison in artworks of Asia and Europe, like Chinese porcelains painted with activities that women engaged in, intellectual activities, writing, painting, playing Wei-Cheng, and then comparing them to European paintings of women showing bare breasts or being carried off by satyrs and such. I think that would be quite interesting.
That issue arises in the 17th century already in the writings of Louis Lecomte, and David Porter has made some initial comparisons of that sort. Yeah, that could be interesting.
Yeah. Another comment from also has the interesting information from Jenna Baker. One of the issues with the audience is to get people from one culture background to look at the art of other cultures. It is frustrating for curators to think that only Asian people are going to be interested in Asian art, or the only Mexican Americans want to see Mexican art. We want Asian people to look at Mexican art and Mexican people to look at Asian art. When I did an exhibition on Japanese no theater, Mask and Prints, I got interviewed by a Spanish newspaper reporter. That helped. I feel we then return the question, just who's the audience? And what's the difference between here and say in China, in Japan, or in Korea? There is a difference. Here we have a very varied audience. And also Wang Tao mentioned earlier, what's our function of the exhibitions as a city museum or other things? Right? Any comments on this? Or we basically all share this view? Right. The last, oh no, more than last, another question from Carol. Say, it has been very interesting to see our panelists from the past several days occasionally reflect on their own place within the history of the field. To all our moderators and panelists, I wonder if the increasing historicization of our subfield in both academia and museums, as well as global pressures on the field that Chelsea mentioned, has made you all more cognizant of the impact that your work has on the ongoing historiography of East Asian art.
That's a question from Fletcher. Fletcher.
Yeah. It's all from, oh yes, from Fletcher, yeah. That is a pretty deep question. Who want to respond? I can say something. I feel I'm probably the oldest here. I don't know. And my career has gone through many stages from China here, from Palace Museum to our Smart Museum. That's totally different animals. And also, I feel a scholar, a museum curator, or whatever profession is really, of course, we have our own career and some kinds of a path, but also it's changing entity, just like the world itself. So like my interest in contemporary art just appeared in the middle in responding to this changing world and art scene. And also the recent interest with my colleagues in this technology, again, responding to the different things. I feel these are all part of what we call the historiography, right, of East Asian art. I feel we all belong to this field, and probably, I feel now the good thing is I don't feel I work alone. I feel all these people here, we can talk, we can collaborate, and many projects are by nature, not just like a book, but are collaborative projects between museums and universities and between different countries, communities. I feel that is the hope. Although now there are a lot of tensions between United States, China, or between the racial group, but I feel just in general, collaboration is the future. We see this in the past 40 years and will continue. That may be beyond the question, but anyway, just responded. Jenny Baker want to thank Martin Power for your perceptive insight.
Again.
Here is basically the end of the questioning.
Wait, there is a question from Li Hong.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry, Li Hong. Yeah. Somehow I skipped you. Li Hong said, I would appreciate thoughts from the roundtable. In recent years, private museums start to emerge in China. Some of them even aspire to collect world art. Other museums also try to do exhibitions by borrowing artifacts from museums, so far mainly from Europe or UK, such as Shanghai Museum, which has done such exhibitions lately. I wonder if this great ground of discussion, group of discussion here could spark dialogue with those new developments.
I think there's one interesting thing to note. In China, there have been more exhibitions of non-Chinese art. I mean, that's true, like Shanghai Museum mentioned here. Actually, every museum, big museum in China have been doing that. But the question here is, again, who curated those exhibitions? So now we're talking about the non-Chinese exhibitions in China. But as I understand, most of them have not been curated by Chinese curators in those institutions, but curated by senders, like lending exhibition museums, institutions. So we'll curate a show, sending them to China. And that has been most of the case. Of course, now there may be more in participations from Chinese museums now when they want to borrow a show. But I think still I would say the dominant force here is still driven by Western museums. Sorry, I used the Western, but non-Chinese museums. So that's, I think that may change in the near future, because with more expertise from Chinese curators, they can curate exhibitions based on their understanding or their demand.
I feel, responding to Li Hong this question, I feel this is definitely very important, the exchange between the museum worlds. Many years ago, I don't know how many years ago, that I think it's Mellon, right? Mellon Foundation has a project inviting these museum curators or deputy directors from major museums in China to spend half year, 1 year in major American museums to be part of the work. That project produced such an important consequence in China, because that group of people later became the director, and the people follow that. So I feel that kind of project can be continued, maybe not the same, but I feel Li Hong is talking about just new ways to link these Chinese museums and American museums. And for example, our discussion here, I believe there among the listeners, definitely people are in China, although there's a time difference, but there are a lot of interest in this. And this conference is advertised through Wei-Cheng, through other venues. And people, I see a lot of responses. Just say, okay, starting or something. So there are interests there as well. So they are listening, many young curators, young people.
Well, thank you for these questions and comments. I like very much Wu Hong's categorization of these different aspects of the talks that have come up, like the spatial and the geographical, and then also of the ways in which these talks have also kind of exploded these categories, like the nation state and the geographical, and the idea of the multicultural and global and the diaspora. I like Ping's comment about the contingent nature of national identities. And then periodization is another category, and chronologies, and then how exhibitions of contemporary art have kind of blown that open into new ways of doing exhibitions. And then the media and genre category that has been expanded with the addition of digital technologies and architectural models and period rooms, opening up into virtual spaces. So all of this, provides so many more areas for discussion and interaction, and I hope this will continue. I just want to say that we have to close up now soon, but we will be putting this symposium online with the permissions that we have from the participants, and we will work on the closed captions before we do that to get them accurate. And also we had spoken earlier about having our panelists contribute papers for a conference volume, and that's something we would like to discuss further as well. So thank you all for your participation.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you guys. Thank you.
Great.
Wonderful, superlative.
Thanks.
See you soon, everyone.
Yeah. Oh.
Thank you, Tao and Deborah.